Once or twice in the past, I've had the mixed pleasure of chairing a panel after Laurie Friedman and trying to see what extra we can say after such an erudite and far-reaching introduction to our day. But I have such a good panel who I'm sure will rise to that challenge. And I wanted just to start really by posing what it seems to me is a central question flowing on from what Laurie has said. The Prime Minister last week in his speech in Greenwich promised us the most far-reaching review of foreign, defence and security policy since the end of the Cold War. And I think in many respects, one useful comparison in that regard, and maybe a way to structure our debate, would be to compare it with the ambitious review which Prime Minister Tony Blair set in train in 1997 after Labour had been out of office for 18 years. And the result, of course, was the Strategic Defence Review, which Laurie already mentioned, led by George Robertson as Defence Secretary in 1998. But then the doctrine of the international community, Tony Blair's words, set out the year later in 1999 in his Chicago speech, which was very much a speech calling for American leadership in the military campaign against Serbia to liberate Kosovo. And I think at the moment it feels the Conservatives have been leading the government in this country for almost 10 years, but in many respects it feels like it's still a new page. There's a sense of starting anew and looking at some really quite fundamental questions in this review. And what I suggest is, in many respects, the world looks very different today in 2020 compared with 1997 and 1998. And it's worthwhile mapping those differences in order to then think about what the implications are for the UK's role in the world. Then, of course, the US was the undisputed superpower. Today, the world looks ever more multipolar, most of all in relation to the growing importance of Russia and China in international geopolitics, but also the growing role of middle powers, as we see, I think, very importantly in the Middle East. Multipolar doesn't simply mean a move to a new bipolarity. Then economic globalization appeared to be ever deepening. Tony Blair, at about that time, basically said you can't stop globalization, it's just like nature. Globalization was deepening. The spread of democracy seemed to be inevitable and desirable, and those who blocked it were on the wrong side of history. But in both dimensions, it's not quite so clear today, with the rise of trade barriers and the rise of political nationalism, not only in Russia and China, but in many countries seen to be stably democratic or moving in that direction, including some of the UK's main allies. And then military competition between the major powers was just not where the action was. The focus of the doctrine of international community was about the West, led by the US, with the UK supporting it actively, pushing for the acceleration of those processes of democratization and economic globalization. And other major states were just not very relevant. And neither was the UN Security Council at that time. The UN Security Council had its moments in the 1990s, but when the UN Security Council stood in the way of doing the right thing in Kosovo or Iraq, as the US and the UK saw it, it was ignored. And it's very different today, after 2 decades of military campaigns, most of which are in retrospect seen as strategic failures, not because of military defeat, but because of political and developmental failures. And increasingly also the return of competition, military, political, economic, between the major powers. The military agenda looks very different today, and we're already seeing that in the way in which the UK armed forces and security services are reorienting. So the challenge for UK foreign policy is, in part, can be framed as how different is today from 1998, 2010 or 2015. And Brexit, of course, is part of that, but I think Laurie made very clear and absolutely rightly, a lot more has changed in recent years than Brexit. As to help us to answer those questions, we have a really fantastic panel. Professor Woods, unfortunately, is unable to get here because of the disruption caused by the weather, for which I think we're all familiar, but we still have three marvellous panellists. I'm going to start with Baroness Neville Jones, who, of course, is just to surprise her, and very distinguished career, instrumental, key role in the decision to set up, and I think very wise decision to set up the National Security Council when the coalition government came to power in 2010, an active member of the Joint Committee on National Security Strategy, to which I have the privilege of being an advisor, and we'd be very interested to hear what she said. I'm then going to turn, just to give fair warning, to our own Tom Keating, who's going to, I understand, talk specifically about some of the implications of Brexit on the UK's role in relation to sanctions and other matters in relation to financial security. And then I'm going to turn to Tom Tugendhat, who has been successfully re-elected as chair of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, really one of the key bodies in our country which holds the government to account in foreign affairs, and Tom himself, of course, a very active participant in many of the key debates that we are going to be touching on today. So, Baroness Neville Jones, over to you.
Do you mind if I use the podium?
Of course you can. I just
do a better job on my hind legs, I think, than sitting down. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm going to do something a bit different. At least I think it's probably a bit different. One of the things I think we doubt about ourselves at the moment is how are we going to muster the will and the resources actually to resume an active place in world affairs? How are we going to find the right positioning, having exited from a bloc, actually to make an impact and to do something worthwhile? And what I'm going to talk about is not so much the objectives that we should pursue, and I'm afraid I didn't hear what Laurie said, but I've no doubt that I would have agreed with what he said. I'm going to talk more about how we try to underpin our effort, because I think, in fact, that affects both the domestic policy we pursue, but also actually how we position ourselves in the world, which I think are increasingly interrelated. Now, in the Commons debate in December, just before everybody went on Christmas holiday, the Defence Secretary, no, it was the Foreign Secretary, said, well, he listed free trade, human rights, democracy, international law as being, fundamental priorities. Absolutely unexceptionable. I think I'd have added climate change, which he didn't put in the list. But I don't think, as I've said, that tells you, how to either promote these ideals or play a role in relation to them, or indeed defend them effectively. It's, I think, a mistake, to try and replicate Britain in the EU without the underpinning of the EU. I don't think we should try to turn the special relationship, such as it is these days, into anything which is particularly exclusive. I mean, even without, I think, the complication of the present incumbent of the White House, I think the two countries, frankly, are too different in culture and scale for that to work well. And we certainly won't, and this is my main point, we certainly won't succeed if we set goals which are not then underwritten by both the necessary will and the necessary resources. So how do we reinvent ourselves? Because that's what I think we have to do. Well, the empire was carried by Britain's prowess in the first industrial revolution, and I suggest that in the 21st century we need to reposition ourselves as a leading hub in the fourth industrial revolution. We should become known as an intellectual, research, innovation center of major significance in the globe. And that doesn't follow that all the globalization follows from all of that, but I think that that should be one of the hallmarks of a Britain in the 21st century. And I don't see, frankly, any reason why, without the energy and without the effort, and we do need to have both of those things. You know, this isn't going to be easy. We've actually got to gird our loins a bit. But if we do that and we organize ourselves, I think we have every chance of making quite an impact and being successful. And I think the reverse is also true, ladies and gentlemen. I'm arguing we really don't have much choice, because I think unless we go down the road of actually positioning ourselves in the new industries, in the new technologies, in the research world, we're actually going to find very quickly that we're paddling in political and economic backwaters. So I think this is a fairly fundamental thing that we need to do. And as has been pointed out already, globalization is under challenge. I think that we're not actually at the moment seeing a great deal of economic integration, and that's been interfered with, obviously, by political mistrust, both behavior in the trading world, but also, of course, the authoritarian social ends to which technology is being put by China. And those two things, mistrust and authoritarian policies, I think pretty toxic combination. And I am concerned that that is going to go considerably further than it already has, and it's going to be quite hard to hold it back. I do think we need to maintain as integrated a system as we can, but it does have to be consistent, obviously, with both values and security. So I think we're going into a more darkening world in which it's going to be harder to defend quite a lot of the values and the ambitions that we hold dear. And that's where I think we need to bring our domestic and our foreign policies together. You know, it's rather odd, isn't it, that the diplomatic service and the civil service are actually separate services. It's a sign of somehow of mental separation. Well, I think we need to end mental separation and bring them together. The NSC, the foundation of the NSC, did begin that process, though I don't think it's taken very far, and we also these days have the notion of policy fusion. But I think we need to take the integration of what we do at home and our ambitions abroad and how we position ourselves abroad a lot further. Now, we've got an emerging industrial strategy, which is upgrading infrastructure, increasing investment in science, technology, and exploratory research. And I would argue that that needs to be developed a lot further, and it needs to be supported by three additional, and I would regard them as indispensable elements: appropriate education and skills, a tax policy that fosters innovation, and an energy strategy that will provide the power that a data-driven, decarbonized society is going to need. Now, those are quite tall orders, but they're quite clear what we need to do. The question is, have we got the guts, the will, and the organization actually to do it? And then I think we need to link these things that we want to do at home and should want to do at home with partnerships abroad. Now, obviously, the US is an obvious candidate, though I'm not clear how easy genuine collaboration with the US is on technology, given their transfer policies. But we have other potential partners. There are the other Five Eyes countries. There's Japan, South Korea, Singapore, to name but a few. And it's not so much that I think we need to talk about trading arrangements with these countries, about which we hear a great deal at the moment. I think it's much more to do with a deeper partnership, which is organized actually to increase our technological capability and reduce our technological dependence, increase the diversity of our supply, and on the upside, promote advanced, prosperous, and liberal societies, bring together our values with that. And we need, I think, an agreed strategy in relation to technology export controls, inward investment, and research collaboration. These things are necessary defenses. The question is, how far do we have to take them? I hope we will escape a decoupled world, but it is certainly something that we have to be on the watch for. And as for cooperation with other Europeans, of course that should go on. And I was a Remainer. I think the UK played its hand pretty badly in relation to the withdrawal agreement, and I don't admire, I must say, the way the EU behaved either. And when it comes to the next round of negotiations, I hope we're not going to have this rather ridiculous proposition that what the UK is trying to do is be a Singapore on Thames, and that's a great, that's breaking all the rules. I mean, either the EU doesn't understand how Singapore makes its money, and that's not by undercutting prices or standards, or it betokens an unattractive desire on their part actively to prevent us being successful. Hope it's not either of those two things, but the debate is not at the moment, it seems to me, on the right issues. And what we don't need is a beggar my neighbour strategy between us. So we do need to cooperate with other Europeans, and we do need to do a lot of things with them together. And if we can do things like Horizon 2020 research, great. Otherwise, if it's not going to be possible, I think we should turn to the possibility of bilateral relations. We've forgotten the joys of bilateral diplomacy. The Foreign Office actually hasn't been engaged in bilateral diplomacy in the way I knew it when I first joined that organization. And we need to renew, I think, our techniques, and which include memoranda of understanding with governments, treaties, treaty organizations, and treaties in which you actually commit to doing various things together. Now, you can pick out the likely candidates in Europe for that kind of thing, but I think that's probably the direction we should try to go. Some of those things are inhibited by the common, obviously the common commercial policy, but there are things we can do in the research and investment world which wouldn't be, I think, inhibited by that. I can see I think I ought to get on with it, which I will. Now, just lastly, defence and security. I haven't forgotten that, and I shouldn't in a place like this. Government's right to want to conduct a defence and security review. I mean, the UK, I think, is falling behind in important ways in terms of capability. And I also think the balance of the mission for our armed forces needs rethinking. We certainly need an effective expeditionary capability, and I don't know that we've got a balanced force there. But we also actually need to give territorial defence more of the cake. I think that we shouldn't kid ourselves, that while we can, I hope, and we ought to be able to get a sensible consultative relationship with the European Union on foreign policy, and we should certainly hang on to and develop our Five Eyes intelligence relationship, I don't think we should kid ourselves that departure from the EU doesn't involve a cost, in which we will have to palliate in other ways in terms of our security in relation particularly to terrorism, crime, and the control of our borders. And we will have to compensate for that. I also do think that in an age of dual technologies, I don't understand why the MOD research program, R&D program, apart from the very sensitive areas, which legitimately should be separate, I can't see why we don't have a single national R&D centre and program. As for our soft power, well, we've got a lot of it, and we should deploy it. English language, university tuition, arts, all the rest of it. That's all part of our diplomacy, all part, I think, of our image. And our aid budget is a huge resource, though I think we should change its focus a bit. I think the focus on direct spending on poverty does need to be complemented by more of the things which now really stand in the way of development, which include business entrepreneurship in these countries and the development of reliable and uncorrupt democratic institutions. And that's part of the answer to the way in which the Chinese are trying to scoop quite a lot of clientele in the third world. So to conclude, I think my message is reinvention, building on our strengths, bringing our domestic and foreign policy together in order to be able to re-engage with the world, surprise the doomsayers, and pursue our ambitions.
Well, Pauline, thank you so much for that. And actually, you have achieved exactly what I wanted, which is to add extra complication to the agenda which Laurie put on the table. I thought you did it very well in terms of introducing those key elements of industrial success, which are so important. If the UK is to prosper in the years ahead, then it needs to address the issues you're talking about in a world which is very different from what it was 10 or 20 years ago. So thank you very much indeed. And also, I think, introduce that debate about the extent to which we have been in the right trajectory in the last decade and focusing on integration across the national security space between foreign and domestic, rather than focusing on more integration across the foreign policy space. So very interesting issues you put on the table. For our next speaker, we've got Tom Keating, who's the director of our Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies. Tom, over to you.
Malcolm, thank you very much. I started the day at 5 o'clock dragging branches out of the lane in order to get to the railway station. I'm feeling a bit weak, so I'm going to stay seated if you don't mind. So as Malcolm mentioned, I'm going to talk about the UK's post-Brexit sanctions policy. But before I do that, I just wanted to pick up one thing Pauline said, which is that, likewise, whenever people talk about concerns about the UK becoming Singapore-on-Thames, I remember my time working for JP Morgan and facing the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which I have to say is probably the toughest regulator in the world. So the idea that becoming Singapore is a bad idea is not necessarily one that I would subscribe to. Anyway, so as relates to sanctions, one early challenge that the government identified as being an urgent priority was the UK's ability to continue to implement sanctions, a foreign policy tool that had become based on EU law and previously often designed and agreed within the EU, given the fractious nature, or the increasingly fractious nature, of the P5 at the UN. And so that gap was, as we all know, addressed in the form of the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act, which has ensured that the UK continues to have the necessary sanctions implementing legislation in place once EU law falls away. On top of that, obviously the civil servants have devoted significant resources to rolling over existing EU sanctions regimes into UK law by creating the necessary statutory instruments and replicating the vast majority of EU sanctions designations under this new legal regime. I would say that apparently Brexit is good news for some people subject to EU sanctions, because they won't actually continue to be sanctioned by the UK because the standards required to meet this new level in the UK won't actually be met. But anyway, that's a small number of people who will be freed by Brexit from UK sanctions. So the measures put in place were sufficient to deal with both a deal and a no-deal scenario. But while the technical and legal work had been completed, an open question remains, which is what will the UK's post-Brexit sanctions policy actually be? For the past 40 years, financial and economic sanctions implemented by the UK have been designed either at the UN level, which will continue to be the case despite the fractious nature of that body, or in Brussels via the consensus of all EU member states, a process in which the UK was widely viewed as being highly influential by both other member states and outsiders such as US policymakers. And as an example of that, in an interview we did in a EU member state, we were told that for many EU member countries, if the FCO lawyers have reviewed the file, then those countries are happy to agree with designation proposals in Brussels. So the power of the FCO's lawyers and the intelligence delivered by the UK has underpinned EU sanctions for many years. But now, of course, no longer constrained by the EU, the UK will have the freedom to design and implement a creative and more independent sanctions policy, potentially. On the one hand, the UK might choose to take that road. On the other hand, the UK might feel the need to remain aligned with the EU and or the US to ensure that it follows the actions of these much bigger economic players and benefit from the economic heft accordingly. In fact, the political declaration clearly states, quote, while pursuing independent sanctions policies driven by their respective foreign policies, the parties recognise sanctions as a multilateral foreign policy tool and the benefits of close consultation and cooperation. It continues, consultation on sanctions should include the exchange of information on listings and their justification, development, implementation and enforcement, as well as technical support and dialogue, etc., etc. In other words, at least as far as the political declaration is concerned, there is an anticipation of close coordination. But answering the question as to what the UK's post-Brexit sanctions strategy should be is difficult to fathom. Beyond the Foreign Secretary's repeated references in Parliament recently to the use of human rights sanctions, it has not yet been clearly articulated. As the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee noted in a June 2019 report, quote, little high-level thought appears to be given to UK priorities for post-Brexit sanctions. And I thank Tom for inviting me to give evidence to that committee, and that might even be a quote from me, which I still agree with. So, with the technical work required to prepare the UK sanctions regime for Brexit now complete, and to respond to this challenge, here at RUSI, we formed last year a task force on the future of UK sanctions policy. It's composed of former UK and US government officials, academics, policy experts, and senior private sector executives to try and think through what a future UK sanctions policy could look like. We've held a number of workshop meetings. The last one is this coming Wednesday, and as mentioned already, we've made a number of trips to EU member states to gather their input on how the EU will function without the UK on sanctions, and just how the UK should perhaps coordinate with the EU in the future. I'll touch on the highlights of the first paper, which you can find online in a moment. The second workshop considered the issue of coordination and how the UK's future sanctions regime will exist alongside those of other countries, and that paper will be out shortly. And then the final workshop, as I say, on Wednesday, is going to wargame what would the UK have done, what could the UK have done in cases such as the Skripal poisonings, had it had the independence to impose sanctions as it wished back at that time. So in the first workshop, we considered three questions. What role should sanctions play in UK foreign policy after Brexit? How should UK exercise the range of use cases that were put forward in the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act? And how should the British government work with the private sector to prepare them for independent sanctions? I'm mindful of getting Malcolm's stare, so I will briefly touch on the findings of the first paper. The first was that it's obvious that the government should develop a strategic approach to sanctions and should clarify what its objectives are and what the threshold for use of sanctions will be, and how that will underpin UK unilateral sanctions policy. Are sanctions best used as a reactive tool in response to the shooting down of an airliner? Are they best used in response to international agreement? Or are they best used as a proactive tool to steer wider foreign policy objectives and change behaviour on sanctions? One of the things I think we've all learned is that sanctions are easily issued, but are difficult to repeal, or at least difficult to find the excuses and the evidence to repeal. And clearly the government needs to be clear. If it's seeking changes of behaviour, it needs to be clear as to how and when sanctions will be repealed. The second is something that the United States has done actively, and that's use sanctions to protect national security. So using sanctions not only as a tool for advancing foreign policy objectives, but also to respond to national security threats such as those presented by serious and organised crime. Sanctions are used to pursue corrupt individuals who seek to enjoy what London has to offer might also be considered. We frankly, and this will be potentially an unpopular point, but we frankly think we should avoid the popular shorthand of Magnitsky and instead just simply call them human rights and corruption sanctions, because this will allow for a more clinical application of these sanctions against individuals in any country. We need to reassess the government's capabilities. Should the responsibility between the Foreign Office and HM Treasury in the form of OFSI continue to be split, or should these be combined to bring more effectiveness, and clearly more staff are needed? And then finally a thought on the private sector, but I'll pass over that. The second workshop considered coordination. Obviously in the near term, coordination will be straightforward, particularly with the EU, as we are likely to continue to track what the European Union is doing. But in the long term, sanctions coordination between the UK and other sanctions regimes could become complex as UK policymakers begin to establish the framework through which it will work with the EU and the US on sanctions issues. The UK could continue to take a middle road, seeking coordination both with the EU and the US when and where it makes sense, or it could choose to more closely align with one or the other. Early indications suggest that freed of the EU consensus model, the UK may choose to be more forward-leaning, particularly in areas where UK sanctions activity can perhaps help define the indefinable global Britain and UK values such as human rights. Of course, this is a potential risky approach at a time when the UK government will be seeking to sign trade deals with countries that may harbour human rights abusers or fall short themselves on upholding standards of human rights that the UK would interpret as representing UK values. So to conclude, sanctions are a very visible indicator of a country's foreign policy objectives. The use of sanctions for signalling disapproval are likely to feature in UK foreign policy considerations. But sanctions are not merely a tool for signalling, they are a tool that seeks to coerce and change behaviour. For that to have the greatest chance of succeeding, a broad coalition is required to ensure maximum economic pressure is applied to the target. On its own, there will be few opportunities for the UK to apply such pressure. Thank you.
Tom, thank you very much indeed, and it's just one of your work is just one of the examples, one of the most important examples of the work which RUSI is doing on the implications of Brexit for security policy. And actually, in many ways, sanctions is a leading indicator of this, because this is, in most areas of regulation, of course, the UK will remain bound by EU regulations until the end of the transition period in December. But in the case of sanctions, we're already in the process of establishing those separate national regulations, and it's both an opportunity and potentially a challenge, as they say. But it's potentially a much broader issue as to when the UK has independent regulatory power across a whole range of different areas, many of which have security dimensions. How will it use that opportunity, and how will it ensure continuing coordination with the European Union and indeed the United States? So, fantastic case study, but also very important in its own right. So for our final introductory speaker, I'm glad to hand the floor to Tom Tugendhat from the Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament. Tom.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm used to RUSI being able to predict the future, but I have to say I'm never more impressed than I am with Anand, who for years I've been wondering why his think tank is called UK in a Changing Europe and not Changing UK in a Stable Europe. But clearly he knew what was coming. He predicted Sinn Féin's victory in Ireland. He predicted the deal in Thuringia that put the AFD within, well, spitting distance of government, and he's predicted any number of the different changes that we've seen, so it's a great pleasure to be here. But actually, RUSI has clearly also predicted the future, swapping an international foreign secretary for a Europe minister, knowing that the focus on Europe is going to be the growing element. So congratulations to David Lidington on taking over your chair. This change in Europe is going to be the really defining moment for us, because actually, the reality of the change in Ireland has not been absorbed into the UK at all. This is not simply a change in the way the UK deals with the European Union or one of its member states, or indeed the only European state or the only foreign state with which we have a land border. This is actually likely to have huge impacts on our relationship not only with the United States, whose Irish diaspora, as we know, is extremely important, but actually with many countries around the world. Sinn Féin's ties to Venezuela, for example, and to the Maduro regime are going to have an impact in the way that we here engage. The questions in Thuringia are also important to us because they point to, again, a rise in anti-European national sentiment in various different ways. They point to a different European polity than the one that we've been used to for 30, 40 years, and they point to a very important moment of change for the UK's approach. But of course, Europe doesn't sit alone. The world too is changing, and we know, because we have seen it very actively, the US change in outreach, which is really more of a continuum than a revolution. We know that the Obama regime, and indeed before it, many US regimes have attempted to pull back from the international and been constantly drawn in. So what we're seeing today is not a U-turn, but a continuum. We know that China's new expansion, again, is not new, but merely a graduated increase from where it was in the 90s. But the speed of acceleration has grown. And we know, of course, that within all of that, the nation state itself is changing. The ability of nations to control what is going on within their own borders is changing. And so it's into that context that I ask, what is Britain's role in the world? And we've heard two, I think, very, very good explanations of ways in which we can seek influence. And I think both of them, both our previous speakers had very important points to make. I wish I could say the same, Laurie, but I didn't listen, I'm afraid. I wasn't here. So otherwise, I'm sure I would agree. But the nation state, I think, has got some very real challenges. And I would argue that there are three areas that we really need to look at. The first, and if you'll excuse my stealing an allusion from the current 5G debate, we need to defend the core. And what do I mean by that? I mean defending those things that actually make the UK valuable, worthy of partnership and important as an international actor. And I think that's where we get into defending the rule of law, which, as we know, in various different ways, even the UK rule of law has been corrupted by the elements that Tom has cited. It means defending tech, and we have had a very strong focus on the theft of intellectual property around the world. Of course, we've seen it particularly with Chinese partnerships, but actually it applies in other places too. And defending innovation. And here is where I speak about universities. We are seeing not just the theft of intellectual property in our university sector, but actually the silencing of debate and the killing of innovation. And those three elements, I would argue, are the core to the UK's strength in the world. And if we lose them, then we are starting from a lower base. The question is, how do we defend them? Well, that's where we get into talking to our new partners. Now, of course, working with the European Union in some form of new arrangement is important, working with the US is important, and yes, working with China is also important. But if we are to extend Britain's influence, if we are actually to define our role in the world, we need to not be looking at the West Indies as the United States or the East Indies as China, but the new Indies, those countries that have been independent trading nations for a while and with whom we can tie up new independent relationships. And those new Indies, who are they? Well, they are countries like Japan, they're countries like Singapore, and they're countries like Australia. Now, there are more that are emerging over time, and there are new relationships that we need to be looking to strike with them. So I think that's the second point. And what do we do with them? And yes, with those members of larger blocs who are willing to do it. Well, we do what Britain's always done, which is we write the rules. Now, that doesn't mean that we seek to be some sort of imposition on the world, but we look to find the ways in which we agree as much as possible, the ways in which we defend each other's access to genuine free and fair trade, and we seek to write rules that promote it. Now, those are the three challenges that the UK has to make. But in order to achieve them, we need to do one more thing, which is actually to invest in ourselves. And that investment, frankly, has been long overdue, and many of us have been arguing for it for a long time. Now, I've heard the argument made that we need to spend 3% on defence, or we need to spend X% on foreign aid, or whatever it happens to be. I'm not in the business of putting numbers or percentages as a target. They're not. The correct target is the influence you seek to have, not the amount of money you're trying to spend on it. Now, for us, that means looking very hard at the Foreign Office and thinking really hard as to whether or not it is actually achieving its aim, whether being a lobbying institution for various pressure groups is actually achieving British strategic aim. Because there is real question over that. And looking at defence and asking as well whether being effectively a procurement arm of various companies in the UK is actually achieving Britain's defence aim. There's a real question over that too. And in aid, well, thinking about what is the purpose of foreign aid? The purpose of foreign aid, like the purpose of diplomacy and the purpose of defence, is the prosperity and happiness of the British people by defending the values and encouraging the prosperity of others. It isn't to be another branch of Oxfam or Save the Children or any other organisation, as noble as they are, because they are charities. You choose to give them money or not. Foreign aid is not the same. Foreign aid is tax money. It is money taken by force from the British people. And therefore, the responsibility on how to spend it is different. That does not mean, I should be clear, that it does not mean it should be used as back channels into defence contracts or anything like that. The ODA rules are good, and they should be followed. But they should also be applied within a strategic context that supports the aims of the prosperity and happiness of the people of these islands. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. Again, putting yet more really knotty and fascinating questions on our agenda. I think quite rightly you brought us up to speed with the developments over the weekend and asked how fundamental a change it will mean. Of course, it will depend on whether Sinn Féin is represented in the new Irish government or not. But you're absolutely right that sometimes we talk about UK foreign policy as if it's about the Middle East or the Asia Pacific, but it's also about our most immediate neighbour, and there's no country more important, I think, in many respects than the Republic of Ireland to our security and indeed prosperity and our relationship with the European Union, as we've seen in the negotiations over the last year. So absolutely right putting that on the agenda. And I was struck by the many questions. You didn't necessarily answer all your questions, Tom, at the end. You put absolutely the right questions on the table. If this is going to be a fundamental review of foreign defence and security policy, then we have to ask those fundamental questions about the Foreign Office, about the MOD, and indeed about our large aid programmes. So we have a bit of time for questions, but we only have 15 minutes, so I'm going to not ask the questions that I was going to ask, but throw it open to the floor and see who would like to. We've got a lady just halfway up there here, yes. And could you introduce yourself when you ask your question?
Yeah. My name is Kogila Balakrishnan with the University of Warwick, and I was also formerly the Undersecretary for Defence Industry with the Malaysian Ministry of Defence. An observation, come question. So in my previous job as the Undersecretary, as well as in my role at the University of Warwick, travelling to Asia, I see that the UK has taken on a specific role of being seen as part of the European Union. Whether that's deliberate or not, it sees itself, I mean, from the Asian perspective, UK is seen more as a European country. So post-Brexit, how does UK see itself rebranding itself to be not to be seen as part of EU, and is the UK resourced to take on that role on its own without EU behind it? That's my question. Thank you.
And that's a pretty big question, so we'll come back to the panel in a moment. I'll take a number of contributors from the floor first. The gentleman here, and then here.
Bill Robbins, former military. Pauline, you mentioned two things. One is that the links between domestic and foreign have got to be much better. And that sort of talks into what we hear about the forthcoming integrated review in terms of getting that act together. You also said we've got to really ride the fourth wave, and that says to me that we've got to be a lot better about shifting information across government, and that means, it seems to me, that we've got to be a lot better at working with industry. In the lack of a government CIO formal point, does that indicate to you that either the MOD, and this comes back to the Tom's point about the MOD just being a procurement arm looking after British industry as opposed to defence, and I'd like to unpick that with you, Tom, a bit, because I think it's a good painful point, and it needs unpicking. But does that to you say a far better grip by Cabinet Office Minister and the muscle that he needs to do it across defence to really pull this together, possibly with a reinstated CIO? Or does the MOD, as the big kid on the block who knows about high-tech acquisition and working with industry, do it? How do we reset that relationship? And Tom, I really am interested in unpicking your point too.
Right, and the gentleman here.
Thank you, Keith Best, former MP. I want to ask really about the bilateral agreements that Pauline Neville Jones referred to, and particularly with respect to Russia. In my military days, when I stared down the barrel of a gun across the inner German border at what was then known as the Soviet Third Shock Army, it struck me the enormous problem of misunderstanding and miscalculation of each other's intentions. And I could go into that in great detail, which I won't. But it is fundamental there. And if you put yourself in the position of Russia, it's seen its empire diminish. It seems itself encircled enormously. It has a great deal of pride as an international actor, but it has a weak economy. Do you think there is a capacity for Britain trying to actually get to understand the Russians a little bit better and letting them know that we want to understand them a little bit better, and therefore that leading to a form of détente, which sadly we're not seeing at the moment?
Right, I'm going to take a fourth just back here, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Josh Arnold-Forster, former Labour Party advisor. I'm intrigued with the discussion of DFID and DFID spending. Tom, does that mean that you're in favour of amending the Act that requires DFID spending to be focused on poverty? Because that was Claire Short's legacy for us all. And then just a point on the MOD's, your picture of the MOD as a procurement branch for British industry. I think a number of people in this room would say increasingly it's a procurement branch for US industry or European industry.
Right, we've got some meaty questions there. There's probably at least 7 questions there, but I won't ask the panelists to try and answer all the questions, answer the questions which you were most interested in. And I'm going to start with Pauline.
Well, let me try and tackle the DFID point. I do think we should alter the Act, because I think that the focus that is placed on the Act of spending directly on poverty is no longer appropriate. It might have been okay when it was enacted. It's the problem of actually having law rather than policy. We do need actually to revise how we think about how you promote wealth creation in these societies, and they need more help with institutions and with the framework of society that enables them then to be self-generating, as well as help in the business sector and entrepreneurship. It's all of those things. So I think, yes, we do need to change the Act. And we shouldn't, I don't like us sort of trying to get round the Act. I also agree with Tom that we damn well shouldn't be putting money into other charity boxes. You know, it annoys me, frankly it annoys me, actually, to see domestic charities not on television, whereas charities working abroad have the money to go on television and ask you for yet more money. You know, it's not right in my view, so I think we do need to rejig that one. On working with government, working in government and across government and with industry, we still have a long way to go in actually getting our act together between government and industry. And I think this is not all government's fault. Industry has, over the years, shed its responsibility for training the workforce. It's got to take that up again. And, you know, the apprenticeship levy, people complain about it. Let's get it right. But nevertheless, there's got to be a real partnership which goes much further than we have at the moment between the private sector and government in where we focus our energies, what kind of things we do. And that's not picking winners, but it is certainly engaging between business and government on the whole question of innovation. And there I do think that's a very, very key issue for us for the future. And it does mean more coordination inside government too. You've got some very odd arrangements at the moment, which, I mean, the way in which, for instance, DCMS gets its money from the Cabinet Office, I think that's very peculiar. Well, some of it anyway. So, you know, I think there's a lot of not great necessary departmental switches, but actually just getting down to the nitty-gritty proper working relationships and sharing the goals and talking to each other. How do we rebadge ourselves in the world? This is a tricky one, I think. We are a European country, and I think in many respects we will continue to pursue policies alongside European partners, and there will be not much change, but we will be doing it as UK. But there will be areas, I think, where there will be divergence, and it will be noticed. The one word we haven't actually used, either of us this morning, and I don't know if Laurie did, was Commonwealth. And there are Commonwealth links, and we should actually use some of those Commonwealth links. And they apply particularly in some of the areas where in my view, we need to see strengthening. The universities, our research and collaboration, a lot of these things already have their lifeblood inside Commonwealth links. So we should make the most of that. So I think we will see, the UK having quite a spread of being British, which will include both European and British elements.
Very good. Tom.
Well, I think most, in fact, all references to Tom from the questions were to that one. But I'm going to have a go at just one point I wanted to make with regards to this working with industry. So that one of the questions that I ask myself regularly is, what's the UK's geo-economic strategy in the context of Brexit? So in other words, where is the financial support that underpins trade relations going to come from? And I say that at a time when the banking industry is doing its best to run home rather than out there, so it's severing financial relationships with countries around the world for lots of understandable reasons. Barclays sold down its stake in Barclays Africa, for example. So the commitment of the UK financial sector to going out there and supporting this trade that the government would like us to do is definitely lowering. And so I think unless we work with private industry, not just to procure stuff and make stuff and build stuff, but to finance stuff and finance the exports and the trade we want to do, then there's a risk that this desire to trade more internationally will be dead on arrival. Because without the underlying finance, look at what created Empire 1.0. It was one of the elements was the ability to finance that kind of trade expansion. And if we can't work with the private sector to achieve the finance we need, then we will hobble ourselves. So we need a geo-economic strategy. We need a government chief investment officer, or whatever you want to call it, who actually job it is to bring the private sector, the finance sector along. And at the moment, as far as I can see, that's not happening.
The other Tom.
On the EU question, I think that will just grow. Madam, I think when you look at the way that the UK works around the world, I agree with Pauline. We will remain a European power, and in many ways will stay very closely aligned. Countries like the Baltic states, and I see one of the ambassadors from there here today, will remain exceptionally close partners for a whole series of different reasons, from political outlook to threat perception to any number of different things. And I don't see that changing just because we're not members of the European Union. On the MOD reform, I'm afraid I'm not even going to touch on it because I could go on for hours and still not finish. So I'll leave it there. On Russian détente, I'm afraid I don't agree at all. I think the UK has made a very, very clear outreach to the Russian people in various different language groups through the BBC World Service and many other things. The problem with Russia is not that we're not trying to achieve détente. The problem is that it's being governed by a mafia kleptocracy, ruled over by a dictator who is currently in the final throes of his life and is therefore holding his power closer and closer until he dies sometime in the next 5 to 10 years. Right. Any other questions on Russia? On DFID. DFID's a really interesting challenge because actually DFID is largely doing the right thing already. DFID is largely already, if you look at the way that they're investing in projects in India, for example, by doing startup in technological incubators that are going to produce technology that is useful not just for the Indian economy, but also perhaps for poverty alleviation around the world, they are doing absolutely the right thing. So this is not an attack on DFID, this is an attack on the way that strategic priorities are aligned by Her Majesty's government here. And this is where DFID has, or the Foreign Office has, it doesn't really matter who does it, but somebody needs to bring together the alignment of things like Home Office resources in terms of police training, the Lord Chancellor's resources in terms of judicial reform, the DIT's resources in terms of trade outreach, so that the efforts that are made in poverty alleviation are actually embedded, and they're not just, you know, in the old biblical sense, throwing the widow's mite in the box. They are actually the kind of reform that is going to embed serious trading partners for the UK in years to come. And that's why I say it in the interest of the prosperity and happiness of the British people, not because I think that's in conflict with the countries that we're seeking to aid, but actually because it focuses on making sure these are long-term investments which will actually make the changes that will result in the genuine prosperity and happiness of our partners as well. And that's why, you know, organisations like the Commonwealth are really important, because they're a way of having that engagement as equals. And then there are various other different forms where we can look at how we do it. But I think there's some real opportunities there, and that's where I would argue that Tom's absolutely right on. I mean, Empire 1.0, let's face it, was built on the industrial ability of the insurance market to produce volumes of capital that were able to go around the world and lower risk. We're not going to get the same sort of, you know, coke high of cash that the insurance markets gave to London in the 17th century. But when you look at the way that, for example, the new pension system is working in the UK, this is very early days, and you compare it to the Australian superannuation scheme, which has effectively generated 2-3 billion Australian dollars worth, I think it is, of sovereign wealth fund to be invested around the world. I mean, that's pretty phenomenal. Now, I don't know what our compulsory pension, you know, whatever it's called now, non-discretionary pension, where you've got to join and 5% at the moment and it'll go up and so on, where it's going to end up with. But I wouldn't be at all surprised to find out that in 10, 15 years' time, we end up with very, very large amounts of investable money from the British people. And looking at how we invest it, I don't mean the state does it, but looking at how we incentivize investment so that it furthers the interests, the long-term interests of these islands and our friends, I think would be a sensible thing to do.
Well, the rules don't encourage it at the moment. That's part of the trouble.
No, indeed.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring this session to an end. I think one of the things that I've liked so much about this session is that it's illustrated very clearly how complicated foreign policy is and how so many aspects of our national life are part of that. And we've got a very rich agenda for the rest of the day. I'm also glad that we didn't, our speakers didn't entirely take the bait which Bill gave us earlier in relation to Tom's comments on the Ministry of Defence. But I'm glad to say we have a whole session on defence this afternoon, and we will make sure your question is answered by Lord Houghton and Angus Lapsley and Sophia Besh, who are the three excellent speakers in that session. So without further ado, can I thank the panellists for their excellent contributions. Very good. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Nice to see you.
Good to see you.